passes by. Why shouldn't I know of love? Why wait around when each age has a sage who has found that upon this earth love is all that is really worth thinking of? It must be fun, lots of fun, to be sure when day is done that the hour is coming when you'll be kissed and then you'll be kissed again. Miss Peggy Joyce says it's good, and every star out in far Hollywood seemed to give it a try. So why shouldn't I?
By the ocean we set and we pet till we get swept out by the tide. You may have been to Paris and kept both of your eyes open wide, but you ought to see me and Marie by the old seaside. If you want to see a thing of beauty, you should see me spooning with my little cutie by the old seaside. For when once we get the proper setting, we begin a petting and go on a petting till we end by getting such an awful wetting from the tide. First we talk about that and this a bit, then we walk about and hug and kiss a bit, till we finally find a spot where we can hide.
We must honestly acknowledge the circumstances we inherited. 94 million Americans are out of the labor force. Over 43 million people are now living in poverty. And over 43 million Americans are on food stamps.
We're going to have a heart attack in credit. Without credit, nothing gets done. Farmers can't plant, farmers can't harvest. They can't ship it to the silo can't ship it. The grain can't be manufactured into bread, and then once it's bread, it can't get shipped to the final destination because every one of those operations involves credit. So when credit stops, you're going to see basically a seizure of all goods making it to markets. So there won't be goods available.
And how big a crash could you be looking at?
It'll be the worst in your lifetime.
And the worst scenario for that would be things like Zimbabwe and Venezuela.
This truck carrying corn flour and pasta never made it to the grocery store. Looting in Venezuela is on the rise.
Each day at dusk, the unemployed converge on this sidewalk trash heap in downtown Caracas, picking through rotten fruit and vegetables tossed out by nearby shops. But it's not just the jobless that search through garbage for food. They're joined by many who still consider themselves part of Venezuela's middle class, even though their living standards have long declined, pulverized by triple-digit inflation, food shortages, and a collapsing currency.
Hey everybody, this is Mike with On Point Preparedness. It is 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I got to get to work early in the morning, so it's pretty late, but I had to stop and take a pause and get a warning out because I think we're in a critical situation. And I don't throw that term around loosely as some type of clickbait. I truly believe we're in a critical juncture in terms of end times events. Now, the reason I say that is because I just got done, or I'm almost done watching this video by Greg Hunter, USA Watchdog. I have a lot of high respect for Greg. I've referred to him on my channel several times over the past couple years. He is a former CNN reporter that was just completely disenchanted with the mainstream media and left. Maybe it was 5 to 10 years ago. It's been a long time. And he decided to go independent on YouTube, and his specialty or his focus area is to interview financial analysts that are truthers. You have truthers in almost every aspect of society, whether it's food or medicine, these whistleblowers. Well, he focuses on the financial analysts. And the people that he interviews are not wash-ups or anything like that. These are very prominent, well-respected people, very smart people that are managing millions and sometimes billions of dollars for their clients and these hedge funds. And so they've got some really interesting things to say over the years that, again, this market has been propped up artificially ever since 2008 and the too big to fail banks. And we all know that. And I've been watching this for a long time and I've been heeding their warnings, but this video is different. This has a different tone. This has a different flavor, and it's a critical warning from these three individuals, and you really need to hear it for yourself. I'm going to put a link in the YouTube description box. I encourage you to watch the entire hour. Some of it you may not understand because there's some financial jargon in there, but I did pull a couple transcripts from the video just so you know what's going on, just so you're prepared. Now, before I actually get into the transcripts, let me just frame this up for you a little bit. And why I pay so much attention to Greg's channel. Prophecy and the end times. There's a lot of things that people use as guidance to determine whether or not we're the terminal generation. Some people look at the wars and rumors of wars, and they combine that with the fact that we've had some pretty catastrophic natural disasters in terms of tsunamis, forest fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, you name it. Also, the geopolitical stuff, the tensions and turmoil between countries, the civil wars that we've seen break out time and time again over the Middle East and now in Venezuela and elsewhere. We're seeing a general moral degradation of society. And you put these things all together, and there's still a part of some people that say, well, yeah, it's pretty bad, but, what about World War II? During the Holocaust? People probably thought that was the end times. So how are you really sure? How are you definitively sure that you're in the end times? One of the key measures that a lot of people use is that there's a prophecy in the Bible which talks about how there will be a coming together again of Israel in the time of the end, where God is bringing his people back together for judgment. And Israel did come together again. And we're in the 70th year anniversary of that. And so that is a distinct moment that has never happened before in history. And it makes a lot of people think that we are the terminal generation. There is some rebuttal to that, saying that, well, that was because of man's hand via the UN who brought Israel together again. And it wasn't necessarily due to their repentance being brought together to God. But still, they're back together. And so that is a definitive reason why you can think we're in the end times. But on top of that, I think we sometimes get a little bit lethargic about hearing dreams and over dream, and it's been going on for years. We've been hearing this stuff. Are we really in the end times? Doubt starts to creep in. Well, that's where these videos come in, at least from me. And I encourage you to think about it in the same aspect. These folks are not all Christian. Greg Hunter is a good Christian, but a lot of the people he has on are atheists. They're not thinking about the end times. They're not thinking about prophecy. But what they have to say lines up dramatically with prophecy. These people are saying that when this market corrects itself, it's not going to be a simple 20 to 40%. Well, 40% would be pretty devastating, but it's not going to be a normal market correction. They even say that this is going to make the Great Depression and the stock market crash back then pale in comparison to what's going to happen. And over the years, I've been watching multiple people, again, lots and lots of different people that are incredibly smart. And they're stating that when this market goes, it's going to be world-changing. It's going to disrupt everything about the world that we've known to date. And again, a lot of these people are atheists. And you're saying they don't know it, but that really rhymes with everything else that's going on in the world. And so you want a definitive measure to know that we're in the end times? Well, here it is. You got people that are just strictly looking at the situation of the stock market and saying that when this thing goes, there will be a completely new monetary system, financial system. When this system breaks down, don't think about it as just the stock market crashing and mere numbers, that these numbers are going to translate into distribution problems, into loss of retirement, into food disruption, into real catastrophic events of famines and people dying. And again, these are the words of very smart people that are atheists and have nothing to do with prophecy, but us as students of prophecy looking in on what they have to say, you're like, wow. So if they're saying that this market's going to crash pretty soon, and it's going to be the mother of all crashes, the father of all crashes, well, with it lining up with everything else that we're seeing in the world, yeah, we're probably the terminal generation. And it's probably sometime soon. So, okay, now that I've framed that up, let me get into some of the transcripts here. I want to keep this relatively short so you can go and watch the video yourself. Again, these people start off, it's Jim Sinclair and Bill Holter. They start off by saying, and Greg starts off by saying that he's had tons and tons and tons of smart people, lots of different people on his channel. And everyone has been saying, ever since, I'd say maybe 2012, maybe even earlier than that, people have been saying that, oh, it's going to crash. It can't really sustain much longer. And year after year after year, it never happened. And so they address it in this video directly. So let me just pull this over here. And so they address the fact that they were wrong in the past because everything is manipulated, and they just can't believe that the Federal Reserve and the powers that be have been able to falsify for so long. But they're seeing things in the market right now that are pointing perhaps to this fall as a critical juncture. So I'm just going to read some of this verbatim, a little bit of this paraphrase. But to start, they said, okay, we understand. We've heard it for a very long period, maybe even going back to 1968, that there's going to be a period in time when all of this is going to come to fruition, meaning the big crash. And they say, when is it going to happen? When is these events going to cascade? And they're saying it's now. It could be any time from now until maybe sometime late this fall. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the market today, because the market is looking gangbusters. But it's really happening with, or it can be viewed with things happening around the market. And this has no precedent in human history. Whoops. Just like I said, there is no precedent in human history unless you want to go back to the times of Rome. So absolutely crazy stuff here. So let me just go down here. We're not talking, and this is really the catalyst. This is why there's a different tone and different flavor to this interview, why they're saying it's a critical situation. We're not talking about any single standalone event, but tying all the events together. And that is considering the trade war with China and the tariffs at the time of these emerging markets collapsing. They get into the numbers and figures, which a lot of us won't understand, but they are so deeply concerned about these events all cascading together at this very point in time, that they actually requested an interview from Greg Hunter. Usually it's Greg reaching out to people. They contacted him and they said, us two, Bill Holter and Jim Sinclair, along with several of their other colleagues, have all got together and they said, we really need to put out a warning. And Jim Sinclair, just for reference, he doesn't do interviews that often. I think the last time he did an interview was several years. So this was compelling enough for him to get on camera and talk about it. Now, talking about the crash, again, I've mentioned this. The reset is not going to be, or the crash and then the resulting reset, it's not going to be this reset they're talking about with regards to Bretton Woods and an upgraded STR. They say it's going to be something entirely new that doesn't exist now, and it may be being engineered at this very moment. And so we think about the mark of the beast, we think about the ability to buy and sell. We see a lot of the things happening in India where pretty much the entire population has a digital ID and now they're getting biometric identification put onto that. Again, they're not all these people are Christian, but they're talking about a completely new reset that's coming into play. Now they talk about Donald Trump. Greg Hunter is a big fan of Donald Trump. You know my standpoint on Donald Trump, but I found this very interesting what they have to say about Donald. Donald Trump, with his tariffs and trade talks, he is in the background re-engineering the reset. That's their guess. And they state that he's not necessarily a millionaire or a billionaire because of his business. He is a successful businessman because he mastered the science of bankruptcy. And he understands where the United States is and where the world is. And so they're basically saying that he is a master of resetting things and bankruptcy and getting out of it and coming out fresh on the other side. Now, that sounds all well and good, except when you're looking through it with the eyes of a student of prophecy and you say, what? A reset? And Donald Trump, who's sort of the king of resets and really understands bankruptcy and resetting, finances on an individual perspective, and he's going to be in charge of resetting perhaps a global financial system, or at least playing a part in it. Sort of freaky. But we're going to go on. Again, they said that this is going to be catastrophic. I want to get to some quotes later on down the line. But they're stating you need to get ready to live on your own. They don't know if they'll be running water and electricity. There still may be, but basically they're saying there's going to be some serious disruptions and you need to hunker down and prepare. And the mainstream has been considering preppers like myself raving lunatics, and these folks are saying that they don't believe that in any way, shape, or form. In fact, you've seen the articles yourself, and they've been very popular, that a lot of the elites are actually buying property in New Zealand and some other more isolated places and have been essentially building bunkers. So it's not just what you see on Doomsday Preppers. It's, again, very smart, very educated, very calculated people preparing for something that is coming. Now, here's the timing. Greg says, I've heard this before, and I keep hearing this in the spades from multiple sources, but we'll see what your take is on this. They're saying it's the end of September, beginning of October timeframe when this crash is going to come, and everyone's going to know that the emperor or the king has no clothes. And both these guys more or less say the same thing. They say that every fall they're on pins and needles whether this thing is going to go. It's not a hard line in the sand to say 100% it definitively will be, but every single year that this keeps on going on, it's just getting more and more treacherous. It's just really about to break. What's the pin that breaks the camel's back, or the straw that breaks the camel's back? They don't know, but again, a lot of them are talking about this fall. And it seems even outside of financial stuff, right? With the September 23rd stuff that happened with the Pope coming here in 2015, and then the Revelation 12 sign, fall and spring are really heightened spiritual times. And I think you see this play out in the physical realm, the material realm, with a lot of these financial analysts being very concerned about September and October. And so I really like Greg for this point of view. Some of these guys can get really into the technical jargon of, why it's going to crash and when it's going to crash and why they think that is. And I think for the layperson, you get a little bit lost in those conversations. Well, Greg always breaks it down. And he says, you know what? Okay, we get the flavor, we get the tone of this, but what is this going to look like for the guy on the street? I mean, is this going to be awful for people with this, this event? And what Bill Holter says is that it is going to be a system down event. And he said it multiple times before. And I've mentioned it at the beginning of this video. Don't think about it as just a stock market crash. When the markets go, it's going to impact businesses. And a lot of those businesses are going to have to do with food generation and food distribution. And so, yeah, when you think about iPet Goat and you see that prophetic imagery that they put in there with the stocks market crashing and the numbers going down, that translates into the disruption of real goods, real consumer goods. And these guys are really sounding the warning on this. I'm going to catch up on the last 10 minutes here, but again, for the first 56 minutes, you can just tell. You can just tell on their faces and in the tone of their voices that they are deeply disturbed with what they're seeing in the markets right now. All eyes are on this fall. Can't say 100% definitively that it will break this fall, but again, it seems like every year, all of us that follow this genre, all of us that are students of prophecy, again, every fall we're a little bit on pins and needles, and these guys and what they're having to say here is just really concerning. And I just had to tell you guys about this so you can watch it for yourself, test it for yourself, discern it for yourself. Not saying everybody should freak out and go to Costco and rate it, but just know what season we're in. As if we didn't have enough evidence, especially with a lot of the natural disasters happening everywhere, and a lot of the mass animal deaths due to red tides that are happening in more than just Florida. And that great big 8.2 earthquake that happened. I hope you guys watched Dutch Sense, because when that deep earthquake happened, that 8.2, I believe it was, he said that this was, in his career, the largest deep earthquake that he's ever seen. And he correctly predicted that within the next 7 to 10 days after that event, we would see either a massive 9.2 or greater earthquake, or we would see a whole series of more minor, maybe 5, 6, 7s, maybe even 8s across the Ring of Fire. And sure enough, even though USGS and them weren't predicting that, and Dutch Sense was, it happened. And we've been seeing tons of earthquakes. I think there was a UK Daily article that said 70 more or less major earthquakes between 4.0 and 7.0 within like the last 3 days or something. That was a couple of days ago. So the signs are there. And I know that we've been discussing this stuff for several years. I've been on YouTube, how long now? 4 years or so. And people may be getting a little bit exhausted over hearing end time stuff. But in the grand scheme of things, 4 years isn't that long of a time. 5 years, 6 years, even 10 years isn't that long of a time. And you should really heed the warnings and use that time to prepare yourself. Again, not only physically, but spiritually as well. Dig into the Word of God, because we have no real idea how bad it's going to get. And As I mentioned in my last video, you know, when they come for you, when they come to kill or maim you, or when you lose everything, you're really going to want to depend on your spiritual brothers and sisters in Christ. This is going to be a testing time. It's going to be a trying time. If you believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, that's fine. But also know that we're not always 100% right about prophecy and Scripture. I'm sure everyone has initially believed something in the Bible at one point, and then later on down the line, you get a revelation from yourself or someone else, and you sort of change your thinking on things. So I just really want to encourage you that if your heart is set on pre-tribulation rapture, that you cognizantly say to yourself that if I'm wrong and it actually is not a pre-tribulation rapture and we have to go through this thing, I will not curse God for it. I will not curse Him for it. I will not feel abandoned. I will just know that it was I that may have been wrong, and I will obediently trust in God through this trying and tribulation time. Again, who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe all the post-trib people are wrong. But again, if I'm wrong and I had saved up all this stuff in preparation for it, well, then it's no loss to me. But again, that's my worry or my fear, is that some people will be caught off guard and they'll feel like God has abandoned them. If again, post-tribulation rapture is the correct theology. But please do go ahead and watch this video, and I'm going to get to bed. This is Mike with On Point Preparedness. God bless everybody.
That sense of there is no limit, and that all this expansion, this success, this elan, we're not really going to have to pay for it. Now, of course, that didn't turn out to be true. You could see the crash. Why do you think they called it the crash? I mean, it's really an airborne collapse metaphor. You can't crash if you're never left the ground. And it's not like a crack up where you're on the ground and you collide into something else. Rather, it's, you know, the plane fell.
The 20s had been so prosperous in so many places, not in the countryside. The farming industry was in very bad shape in the 1920s. But certainly in the cities, it was very prosperous. People were making fortunes on the stock market. And then all of a sudden, poof, it went. I mean, people, economists, very serious economists, had been saying that we'd reached a new level, a new plateau of prosperity in this country, and we were never going to go back. And then the crash happened.
All through the summer of 1929, there had been ominous rumblings. For months, unemployment had been rising. Automobile sales and department store revenues had fallen off sharply. Across the South and West, farms were failing in record numbers. And still on Wall Street, the delirious optimism continued, undimmed. On August 27, 1929, the Dow Jones average reached its all-time peak as an army of frenzied buyers descended on New York, desperate not to miss a single day's trading, swamping the hotels, camping out on the street in front of the stock exchange, and in the tiny graveyard of Trinity Church on Broadway, where Alexander Hamilton lay buried.
What caused the crash of '29 was excess speculation. What had happened was that the American economy as a whole had begun to cool starting in 1928. And the Wall Street economy disconnected from the underlying real economy and became a speculative bubble. And this fueled this speculation that just took off and took off and took off until, again, one day, somebody woke up and said, this has gone too far. There's an old story about Bernard Baruch, that he had his shoes shined every morning by the same shoe shine boy. And one morning, the shoe shine boy gave him a stock tip. And Baruch went to his office, called up his broker, and said, sell me out. And shoe shine boys are giving stock tips, it's time to get out.
As summer turned to fall, the mood changed. As the stock market dipped, then rose, then lurched downwards again, investors grew increasingly uneasy. In September, an economist named Roger Babson sent a wave of fear rippling through Wall Street when he warned that sooner or later, a crash is coming, and it may be terrific. But most experts brushed away any concerns. Stock prices, one man declared, have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. And then the bottom fell out. On Wednesday, October 23rd, 1929, the first waves of panicky selling began to drive down the price of blue-chip stocks, like Westinghouse and General Electric. The following morning, the fear turned to panic, and brokers began unloading margin accounts at record speed. Stock prices plummeted sickeningly across the board, spurring the rush of sell orders from terrified speculators still more. As anguished shrieks rose up from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the visitors' gallery was cleared. In less than 2 hours, nearly $10 billion invested in stocks was simply wiped out. Outside on the street, crowds massed 6 deep in front of the stock exchange, while hundreds more stood in shocked silence on the steps of Federal Hall. Newspapers would later try to describe the uncanny murmuring sound that echoed off the stone facades of the financial district that morning. It was a collective moan of horror and grief, and stunned disbelief, rising up from thousands of ruined, frightened men. The biggest crowds gathered outside the House of Morgan, desperately hoping for a miracle. Cheers broke out when word came that a consortium of bankers had agreed to pump hundreds of millions of dollars into the stock exchange to shore up the faltering market. Word spread that once again, the day had been saved by the House of Morgan. But the day had not been saved. On Friday, with the market apparently stabilized, the banks withdrew their funds. The following Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, known forever after as Black Tuesday, another tidal wave of selling hit the exchange, and this time, no one came to the rescue.
Nothing could stop it, and just people wanted out. And this was in the fall. Most crashes tend to be in the fall. And I think, again, it's human psychology. You tend to be more cautious in the fall. I mean, the speculations of summer that seem so brilliant, and suddenly when the chill winds of October come, you wonder if there's such a good idea, and you try to get out. Too many people do that at once, that it causes the market to drop, which causes more people to want to get out, and suddenly, the snowball rolls down the hill.
Hour after hour, the market continued its descent into chaos and pandemonium, as stock prices simply collapsed under the torrent of panicked selling. And desperate brokers fought and screamed and trampled one another to get out.
16 million shares traded that day, which seems like nothing today because we trade 16 million shares in the first 5 seconds of the business day. But the trading record set on the day of the crash, the 16 million shares, was not bested until 1969. It was 40 years before the New York Stock Exchange traded more shares than it traded on the day of the crash. The tickers did not stop running until 7:45, when the market had closed at 3:30, I guess.
In the worst single day in the history of the New York Stock Exchange, the market lost $14 billion in value, bringing the week's loss to more than $30 billion, 10 times more than the entire annual budget of the federal government, and far more than the United States had spent during all of World War I. Worst hit in the short run were the thousands of small investors who, believing that everyone could be rich, had bought stock on margin, sometimes borrowing as much as 90% of its book value. In a matter of hours, in some cases minutes, they had lost everything: their life savings, their houses, and their dreams. Financiers who had not been wiped out tried to put a brave face on things, insisting there was no cause for alarm. Prudent investors are now buying stocks in huge quantities, John Jacob Raskob told the New York Times, and will profit handsomely when this hysteria is over.
Wednesday, October 30th, 1929. Mr. Raskob was asked if he believed that the decline in the stock market would have great effects on business. He answered that he did not believe the effects would be other than temporary, lasting probably 2 or 3 months, and that he did not believe that the effects would be drastic in other than luxury industries. The New York Times.
But others feared the worst. The present week, one newspaper editor declared, has witnessed the greatest stock market catastrophe of all times. It would take a decade and a half for the American economy to fully recover.
I think the reason the crash lives on in the American folk memory, although there aren't many people alive today who were adults when the crash happened in almost 70 years ago now, but what followed the crash, the Great Depression, which permanently scarred the American psyche. And we remember the crash as the beginning of the Great Depression, although in fact the two had nothing to do with each other, or very little. But that's why I think the crash became such a benchmark, because it was this very sharp line between the prosperity and the giddy cocktail party of the 1920s and the awful depression of the 1930s, and the bread lines and the apple sellers and the bonus riots and what have you.
Surviving the coming economic collapse. The best emergency food methods for keeping your family alive. A second catastrophe promises to follow in the footsteps of a first. It's a catastrophic food shortage. The time to prepare for that is now. Lessons by expert preppers on storing up emergency food on a budget. Emergency foods are something that families, church and relief organisations, schools, institutions and food banks should be stocking up on nowadays, while it's still possible, while there's still food to be had. Our nation is sitting on a ticking time bomb, and we unfortunately cannot tell exactly when this bomb is going to finally detonate. But we can hear it ticking, louder with every passing year. Yet, no matter how frantically government and the military work to defuse the bomb, defusing this bomb continues to elude them. Of course, I'm using an analogy to describe some serious crap hitting the fan. When it does, we are looking at a famine on a level that this world has never seen before. Nationwide food shortages, and then famine. No more food coming in from anywhere. What if the day comes where stores never reopen? At the point where your survival food stores become exhausted. After several weeks following a collapse, you're either going to have to turn to begging for food or a very difficult and frustrating life trying to hunt, fish, trap or forage in the adjacent forests called living off the land. But truly, only the adept, the knowledgeable and the experienced are going to be able to live off the land. And the ones who do won't be found in any nearby woods or hills, because there won't be anything to hunt or forage for in the nearby woods or hills following a major disaster. Wildlife is very sensitive to the presence of people, so a large number of people fleeing into wilderness regions is going to send much of the wildlife fleeing for remote regions. It's these remote regions that the hunting can be good, but only the most adept are likely to make it that far, where there are no roads, where there may be rugged mountains and canyons and rivers to cross. There may be dangerous weather conditions to deal with depending on the season. If you can make it to a remote region, I'm talking really remote, it will be possible to live off the land but it won't be easy. Are you just fine right where you're at? In a worst-case scenario, we may see martial law, a government collapse, a civil war of sorts. Some of us should be stockpiling food. Some communities, some neighborhoods, some small towns and cities will likely make it through the first few months following a collapse relatively fine. Others won't do so well and will be very dangerous places to live. You'll need some friends, you'll need some firepower. Hopefully God is on your side with all that firepower and He's going to use you in some way to make a difference for good. At one time, we were a nation under God, success after success, innovation after innovation, dreams and bigger dreams. America had God's favor and was the gem of the world. People from around the world dreamed of moving here, and many did. But today, America no longer has God's favor. We have become God's enemy. Not all, but a lot of us. How long will your emergency food last? If disaster struck today, how long would your stockpile last? Careful, it's a trick question. I'm not asking how long you would be able to live off your stockpile. I'm asking about the actual shelf life of the foods in your basement or pantry. Though you may have beans and cereal to eat, in theory can last 10 years or more, the way you store them can substantially decrease or increase that amount. In other words, you may have quite a bit of food in your pantry right now. That is less than a year until it expires. And that's a tough position to be in if a serious, earth-shaking disaster struck today. The scoop on emergency food storage, extending the shelf life of several foods. Food storage done right, so you can double, triple, or even quadruple the shelf life of your foods. Let's talk about that for a moment. It all starts with the 5 food storage enemies: oxygen, moisture, temperature, light, and pests. The 6th one is time, but there's nothing we can do about that except rotating our stash. Now, if you're looking to get 10, 20, or even 30 years of shelf life off your foods, you need to tackle all of these enemies, no exception. Extending the shelf life of grains, beans, and rice. These are some of the foods with a long shelf life. Preppers like to stockpile that are also cheap. However, not all varieties are worthy to be in your stockpile. For example, Cheerios and other breakfast cereals you typically buy at the supermarket have a shelf life of 6 to 8 months. Processed cereals have many refined and hydrogenated oils in them. Oils goes rancid, so even if you were to use the preservation techniques we're going to talk about in a minute, it still wouldn't be worth it. Thus, step 1 in storing your food for a really long time is to pick the right food. When we're talking about real long-term emergency food storage, opt for storing white rice, not brown, dried beans, and whole wheat berries, not breakfast cereals. Rice, beans, and wheat berries should be the staples of your survival stockpile. Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers for storing emergency food. The best way to store your emergency food is in Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers. This is a no-fail combination used by most preppers, provided your food is dry before you store it. Otherwise, you can wake up with condensation after you seal the package, which is not a good thing. The process is simple. You fill the bag nearly all the way to the top, seal it using an iron or a head straightener, but not before you add a pack of the oxygen absorber. Depending on the size of the bag, oxygen absorbers are small packs of iron powder and create a nitrogen environment by removing any oxygen present through chemical reactions. So, even if the bag will look like it's got air inside, you don't need to panic, because that's just nitrogen. It's worth mentioning that neither the nitrogen nor the iron powder can affect your food, provided you keep the O2 absorbers inside the original packaging. As you can see, you don't need to vacuum seal the bags. The absorbers will do the trick to prevent growth of aerobic pathogens, such as mold, as well as preventing oxidation. These are two ways oxygen can spoil your food. Besides, your cereals will crumble under the pressure of the bag. Put Mylar bags inside airtight, BPA-free 5-gallon buckets. Next, you should put the Mylar bags inside airtight, BPA-free 5-gallon buckets. This may seem unnecessary, but it's actually a good idea. First off, the bucket will shield the bags from the light, another declared food storage enemy, thus improving shelf life. Second, it protects the bag from accidental puncturing. We talked about aerobic bacteria, but anaerobes need very little or no oxygen to develop. The most important one is called Clostridium botulinum and is responsible for a disease called botulism, not something you want to suffer from post-collapse.
Clostridium botulinum produces one of the most powerful neurotoxins that paralyze their host neuromuscular junctions. The spores are heat and acid resistant, so they are able to lie dormant for a long period of time. Once in the body, the bacteria releases the neurotoxin botulinum, which remains activated even in gastric acid and proteolytic enzymes. The toxin is absorbed by the upper intestinal tract, enters the blood circulation, and finally finds its way to the peripheral nervous system. The neurotoxin botulinum prevents synaptic vesicles from secreting acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. The nerve endings are impaired and causes the individuals to experience paralysis.
Fortunately, this doesn't really occur when storing grains, beans and rice, as long as they're not moist. It's something that mostly shows up in canned food, which we'll tackle in a moment. The last thing you need to do after you've taken care of oxygen, light and humidity is ensure the proper temperature. Anywhere between 50 Fahrenheit and 70 Fahrenheit will work, preferably close to 50. If you do everything right, how long can food last in storage? What shelf life can you expect if you do everything right? This is pretty amazing. White rice can last at least 7 to 8 years, with some sources going as high as 25. Hard grains such as wheat and corn can store for at least 10 years. Soft grains can last about 8 years because the outer shell is not as strong as that of hard grains. Emergency food storage for pasta. Storing pasta for the long term is just as easy as storing beans or grain. If you read the label, they tell you it lasts for 1 to 2 years. But if you store it in Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers, that shelf life can increase up to 10 times. That's 20 plus years in shelf life. Place it in plastic buckets to protect it from light, from crumbling inside, and from accidental puncturing of the bag. Speaking of punctures, you may want to consider storing things like spaghetti in 5mm bags instead of the more common 3.5mm to avoid any sharp noodles accidentally poking holes in the Mylar. Some people like to freeze pasta before storage to prevent larva eggs from hatching. So, to kill these eggs, noodles shouldn't stay frozen for approximately 5 days. But this method is not needed as long as you use oxygen absorbers. Ultimately, freezing the noodles won't hurt them, but it won't really help either. If you decide to do it, you need to allow the frozen noodles to reach room temperature before you seal these noodles in Mylars. Otherwise, condensation will form and allow the growth of mold. Canned food can last several years past its expiration date. There are a lot of myths about canned foods, and I want to burst the ones that have to do with shelf life. The one related to the expiration date. Food experts on shelf life have looked closely at unopened cans of food from several decades back, sometimes recovered from shipwrecks, and the data they found was a real eye-opener. Canned food can last several years past its expiration date, as long as the can has been properly stored and it looks good on the outside, it's not leaking, and the lid is not swollen or punctured. It's probably safe to eat. You still have to check for suspicious smells, but there have been reports of canned food that was safe to eat even after 30 or 40 years. Nevertheless, plenty of people have reported being absolutely fine after eating canned food past the expiration date. Of course, you need to give your cans the same conditions you do to your beans and rice. Keep them in a cool, dry, dark place away from moisture. Now, there are two types of canned food when it comes to how long they last: high acidic and low acidic. The USDA guidelines tell us that high acid food, canned fruit or pickles, can last up to 18 months, while low acid food, canned meat, beans, corn, potatoes, etc., up to 5 years. The acid in these cans contributes to the deterioration of colour, texture, and nutrients over time, of course. As mentioned earlier, if the can looks, smells, and tastes okay, you can ignore the expiration and the best buy dates. In a post-collapse, you might not have a choice anyway. Extending the shelf life of peanut butter. Peanut butter is jam-packed with calories and can last a long time if properly stored. But there's a catch. It's full of oils and, as previously said, oils go rancid over time. It depends which type of PB you're storing, because natural peanut butter only lasts a few months, while smooth and crunchy can last up to a year. To improve its shelf life, you need to keep peanut butter tightly sealed and in a cool, dry, dark place. You should also store it in a glass rather than a plastic jar to increase longevity even more. The alternative to PB is powdered peanut butter, which should store for at least 5 years, closer to 10 actually, and it's good for another year after you open it. That's considerably longer than traditional peanut butter. Food items with an indefinite shelf life. You've probably heard that honey has an indefinite shelf life. The only thing that can go wrong with it is crystallization, meaning the sugar molecules align themselves in a certain way. This is not a sign it went bad, but still, there's an easy fix. Place the open jar in a pot full of hot water and stir it until the crystals dissolve. In order to slow down the crystallization process, simply store the honey at room temperature. Since most of your foods need to be in cool places, you can keep honey in your kitchen or pantry, where you probably have more space. The other items with an indefinite shelf life are salt, sugar, and molasses. But the one thing you should do is keep them away from moisture. It's common for basements to develop mold due to poor ventilation. So the two options you have are to either install a fan, if your basement has windows, a dehumidifier, which unfortunately will incur electricity costs, or use some of the other recommended options depending on how bad things are. The shelf life of seeds. No long-term survival plan is complete without the seeds that will allow you to start a garden once the dust settles after a collapse. In a worst-case scenario, especially those who live in heavily populated areas, that may mean a long and difficult evacuation from a disaster-struck region. The good news about seeds is that they don't take up a lot of space and you can transport them with relative ease when the time is right. Plant that garden finally. The most important thing to seed storage is to keep these seeds dry. Moisture is the biggest enemy, but fortunately, One you can easily defeat: keeping your seeds in a cool, dry place should work. And don't forget to add desiccants to the container and seal them afterwards. Another thing you need to do is dry them before storage. If you don't want to use desiccants, you have other options, such as putting them in paper envelopes. Other options include storing them inside the fridge or the freezer, but if you're left without power in the next disaster, you're still going to use one of the aforementioned solutions. The shelf life of various seeds varies. Some people say they can last up to 100 years. They actually found seeds inside the belly of a frozen mammoth, meaning they lasted thousands of years. It's hard to say, but if you do it right, you can expect to get at least 5 years of storage life and a 70% germination rate. The ones that have the longest shelf life are bean, 2 to 3 years. Radish, muskmelon, cress, collards and cucumber, 5 years. Tomato, squash, turnips, eggplant, sorrel, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts and watermelon, 4 years each. But again, the life of a seed can increase if you do a good job storing them. Emergency food storage for your pet. How to store dry and canned pet food. There are essentially 2 types of pet food you can stockpile, and they're the same ones you feed your pets every day: dry and canned. Surprisingly, canned food lasts a lot longer than dry, because dry food has a lot of fat in it, which causes it to go rancid quickly. Dry food usually lasts a year, while canned food for 2+ years. If you're thinking of using oxygen absorbers with dry pet food, it might not work. You might wake up with mold rings around the absorbers, which will in turn spoil the entire bag, as several preppers have cautioned. The good news about storing pet food, though, is that there's no difference between survival food and what they regularly eat for your pet. The other good news is that pets can eat human survival food, for lack of a better term. For example, dogs can eat white rice, which we already know can last a lot longer if properly stored, being one of the most popular survival foods. As long as you store your pet food in a cool, dry, dark place, such as a ventilated basement, you'll surely get a lot more than the 1 or 2 years it's stated to last. How temperature fluctuations affect emergency food. Before we wrap this up, I need to address an overlooked aspect: fluctuations in temperature. We said earlier that some foods need to be stored at temperatures between 50 Fahrenheit and 70 Fahrenheit, but that's only half of the story. The other half is that you need to keep temperature variations to a minimum, because they too can negatively affect the shelf life. Even if you keep it within the interval at all times, fluctuations between 50 Fahrenheit and 70 Fahrenheit should be avoided. Why store up emergency food? So you can survive during a famine. In the modern age, with so many grocery stores and restaurants bustling with activity and low prices, sometimes high, or many common food items, it's hard to imagine what life would be like if suddenly it all came to an end. Unfortunately, if someone were to pull the plug on interstate shipping and nationwide commercial food processing and commercial agriculture, literally overnight stores across several regions would slam shut their doors, and before you knew it, the greatest disaster in America's history would unfold right before our eyes. Famine, food shortages, long lines stretching possibly miles for a government handout, until the government closes its doors as well. Long lines seeking food at churches, that is until churches run out of food, and soup kitchens. Soup kitchens, once popular with the homeless, but now attracting crowds of hungry and scared citizens and their families looking for food and also looking for a solution. But there won't be one. What about organizations like the Red Cross and Salvation Army? In some communities, in the first few hours and days, they may also be a source of food, but expect incredibly long lines. When or if food finally gets into your hands, unfortunately, it may not be something you really find that palatable. Food storage happens now, not later. It's a sad, unfortunate fact that there will be a day where tens of millions of people realize that so many signs about a coming catastrophe were all around them. But they were just too glued to their daily routines and complacency and stubbornness about life to notice. And it's not just the banksters at the top of the food chain, preying on the consumers, or the super elites at the head of our corporations. No, it's the rest of us also. The people that make up modern day nations caught up in what the Bible describes as carnal, worldly lives, with a complete disregard for God and his warnings about that coming wrath on the world to deal with its many evils and atrocities. Atrocities are committed somewhere on our planet on a daily basis.